Hello and welcome back to the Chronicles. I'm continuing with our exploration into the H.G. Wells story, and it's really, really cool. It's the country of the blind, of course. I'm just going to pick up right where I left off. They were very strange to his eyes, and indeed, the whole aspect of the valley became, as he regarded it, queerer and more unfamiliar. The greater part of its surface was lush green meadow, starred with many beautiful flowers, irrigated with extraordinary care, and bearing evidence of systematic cropping piece by piece. High up and ringing the valley about was a wall, and what appeared to be a um sorry circumferential water channel from which the little trickles of water that fed the meadow plants came. And on the higher slopes, above this flocks of llamas propped the scanty herbage. Sheds, apparently shelters or feeding places for the llamas, stood against the boundary wall here and there. The irrigation streams ran together into a main channel down the center of the valley, and this was enclosed on either side by a wall breast high. This gave a singularly urban quality to this secluded place, a quality that was greatly enhanced by the fact that a number of paths, paved with black and white stones, and each with a curious little curve at the side, ran hither and thither in an orderly manner. The houses of the central village were quite unlike the casual and higgledy-piggledy agglomeration, god damn it, hold on. It's the fake words. That's what got me. The houses of the central village were quite unlike the casual and higgledy-piggledy agglomeration of the mountain villages he knew. They stood in a continuous row on either side of a central street of astonishing cleanness. Here and there, their parti-colored facade was pierced by a door, and not a solitary window broke their even frontage. They were particolored with extraordinary irregularity, smeared with a sort of plaster that was sometimes gray, sometimes drab, sometimes slate colored or dark brown. And it was the sight of this wild plastering first brought the word blind into the thoughts of the explorer. The good man who did this, he thought, must have been as blind as a bat. He descended a steep place, and so came to the wall and channel that ran about the valley. Near where the latter spouted out its surplus contents into the deeps of the gorge in a thin and wavering thread of cascade. He could now see a number of men and women resting on piled heaps of grass, as if taking a siesta. In the remoter part of the meadow, and nearer the village, a number of recumbent children, and then, nearer at hand, three men carrying pails on yokes along a little path. that ran from the encircling wall towards the houses. These latter were clad in garments of llama cloth and boots and belts of leather, and they wore caps of cloth with back and ear flaps. They followed one another in a single file, walking slowly and yawning as they walked, like men who have been up all night. There was something so reassuringly preposterous and respectable in their bearing that after a moment's hesitation, Nunez stood forward as conspicuously as possible upon his rock and gave vent to a mighty shout that echoed round the valley. The three men stopped and moved their heads as though they were looking about them. They turned their faces this way and that, and uh, Nunez gesticulated with freedom. But they did not appear to see him for all his gestures, and after a time, directing themselves towards the mountains far away to the right, they shouted as if in answer. Nunez bawled again, and then once more, and as he gestured ineffectually, the word blind came up to the top of his thoughts. The fools must be blind, he said. When at last, after much shouting and wrath, Nunez crossed the stream by a little bridge, came through a gate in the wall, and approached them. He was sure that they were blind. He was sure that this was the country of the blind, of which the legends told. Conviction had sprung upon him, and a sense of great and rather enviable adventure. The three stood side by side, not looking at him, but with their ears directed towards him, judging him by his unfamiliar steps. They stood close together, like men a little afraid, and he could see their eyelids closed and sunken, as though the very balls beneath had shrunk away. There was an expression near awe on their faces. A man, one said, in hardly recognizable Spanish. A man it is, a man or a spirit coming down from the rocks. But Nunez advanced with the confident step of a youth who enters upon life. All the old stories of the lost valley and the country of the blind had come back to his mind, as and through his thoughts ran this old proverb, as if it were a refrain. In the country of the blind, the one-eyed man is king. In the country of the blind, the one-eyed man is king. And very civilly, he gave them greeting. He talked to them and used his eyes. Where does he come from, Brother Pedro? Asked one. Down out of the rocks. Over the mountains I come, said Nunez. Out of the country beyond there, where men can see. From near Bogota, where there are 100,000 of people. and where the city passes out of sight. Sight, muttered Pedro. Sight. He comes, and the second blind man. Out of the rocks? Oh, sorry. He comes, said the second blind man, out of the rocks. The cloth of their coats, Nunez saw, was curiously fashioned, each with a different sort of stitching. They startled him by a simultaneous movement towards him, each with a hand outstretched. He stepped back from the advance of these spread fingers. Come hither, said the third blind man, following his motion and clutching him neatly. And they held Nunez and felt him over, saying no word further until they had done so. Carefully, he cried, with a finger in his eye, and found they thought that organ, with its fluttering lids, a queer thing in him. They went over it again. A strange creature, Coria, said the one called Pedro. Feel the coarseness of his hair, like a llama's hair. Rough he is as the rocks that begot him, said Coria, investigating Nunez's unshaven chin with a soft and slightly moist hand. Perhaps he will grow finer. Nunez struggled a little under their examination, but they gripped him firmly. Carefully, he said again. He speaks, said the third man. Certainly he is a man. Ugh, said Pedro, at the roughness of his coat. And you have come into the world? Asked Pedro. Out of the world, over the mountains and glaciers, right over, above there, halfway to the sun, out of the great big world that goes down, 12 days' journey to the sea. They scarcely seemed to heed him. Our fathers have told us men may be made by the forces of nature, said Coria. It is the warmth of things, and moisture, and roughness. Okay, hold on. It is the warmth of things, and moisture, and rottenness. Rottenness. Let us lead him to the elders, said Pedro. Shout first, said Coria, lest the children be afraid. This is a marvelous occasion. So they shouted, and Pedro went first and took Nunez by the hand and led him to the houses. He drew his hand away. I can see, he said. See, said Coria. Yes, see, said Nunez, turning towards him, and stumbled against Pedro's pail. His senses are still imperfect, said the third blind man. He stumbles and talks unmeaning words. Lead him by the hand. As you will, said Nunez, and was led along laughing. It seemed they knew nothing of sight. Well, all in good time, he would teach them. He heard people shouting and saw a number of figures gathering together in the middle roadway of the village. He found it tax his nerve and patience more than he had anticipated. That first encounter with the population of the country of the blind, the place seemed larger as he drew near to it, and the smeared plasterings queerer, and a crowd of children and men and women. The women and girls, he was pleased to note, had some of them quite sweet faces, for all that their eyes were shut and sunken, came about him, holding on to him, touching him with soft, sensitive hands, smelling at him, and listening at every word he spoke. Some of the maidens and children, however, kept aloof as if afraid, and indeed his voice seemed coarse and rude beside their softer notes. They mobbed him. His three guides kept close to him with an effect of proprietorship, and said again and again, "A wild man out of the rock." "Bogota," he said, "Bogota, over the mountain crests." "A wild man using wild words," said Pedro. "Did you hear that? Bogota. His mind is hardly formed yet. He has only the beginnings of speech." A little boy nipped his hand. "Bogota," he said mockingly. "Aye, a city to your village. I come from the great world, where men have eyes and see." "His name's Bogota?" they said. "He stumbled," said Coria, "stumbled twice as we came hither. Bring him to the elders." And they thrust him suddenly through a doorway into a room as black as pitch, save at the end there faintly glowed a fire. The crowd closed in behind him and shut out all but the faintest glimmer of day. And before he could arrest himself, he had fallen headlong over the feet of a seated man. His arm outflung struck the face of someone else as he went down. He felt the soft impact and uh, of features and heard a cry of anger. And for a moment he struggled against a number of hands that clutched him. It was a one-sided fight. An inkling of the situation came to him, and he lay quiet. "I fell down," he said. "I couldn't see in this pitchy darkness." There was a pause, as if the unseen persons about him tried to understand his words. Then the voice of Coria said, "He is but newly formed. He stumbles as he walks, and mingles words that mean absolutely nothing with his speech." Others also said things about him that he heard or understood imperfectly. "May I sit up?" he asked in a pause. "I will not struggle against you again." They consulted and let him rise. The voice of an older man began to question him, and Nunez found himself trying to explain the great world out of which he had fallen, and the sky, and mountains, and sights, and such like marvels, to these elders who sat in darkness in the country of the blind, and they would believe and understand nothing whatever he told them. A thing quite outside his expectations. They would not even understand many of his words. For 14 generations, these people had been blind and cut off from all the seeing world. The names for all the things of sight had faded and changed. The story of the outer world was faded and changed to a child's tale, and they had ceased to concern themselves with anything beyond the rocky slope above their circling wall. Blind men of genius had arisen among them and questioned the shreds of belief and tradition they had brought with them from their seeing days, and had dismissed all these things as idle fancies, and replaced them with a new and saner explanation. Much of their imagination had shriveled with their eyes, and they had made for themselves new imaginations with their ever more sensitive ears and fingertips. Slowly, Nunez realized this, that his expectation of wonder and reverence at his origin and his gifts was not to be borne out. And after his poor attempt to explain sight to them had been set aside as the confused version of a new made being describing the marvels of his incoherent sensations, he subsided a little, dashed into listening to their instruction. And the eldest of the blind men explained to him life and philosophy and religion. How that the world, meaning their valley, had been first an empty hollow in the rocks. Had been first an empty hollow in the rocks, and then had come first inanimate things without the gift of touch, and llamas, and a few other creatures that had little sense, and then men, and at last angels, whom one could hear singing and making fluttering sounds, but whom no one could touch at all, which puzzled Nunez greatly until he thought of the birds. He went on to tell Nunez how this time he had been divided to the warm and cold, which are the blind equivalents of day and night, and how it was good to sleep in the warm and work during the cold, so that now, but for his advent, the whole town of the blind would have been asleep. He said Nunez must have been specially created to learn and serve the wisdom they had acquired, and that for all his mental incoherency and stumbling behavior, he must have courage and do his best to learn. And at that, all the people in the doorway murmured encouragingly. He said, "The night, for the blind call their night." Oh, sorry. He said, "The night, for the blind call their day night," was now far gone, and it behooved everyone to go back to sleep. He asked Nunez if he knew how to sleep, and Nunez said he did, but that before sleep he wanted food. So they brought him food, llama's milk in a bowl, and rough salted bread, and led him into a lonely place to eat out of their hearing, and afterwards to slumber until the chill of the mountain evening roused them to begin their day again. But Nunez slumbered not at all. Well, what do you think, guys? That's where I'm stopping today. Maybe he'll learn the ways of these very wise men. Or maybe he'll hold on to his foolish thought that he can actually see things. Ah! Anyway, I'll see you next video. Bye, guys.